It is a great honor to welcome Professor Matthias Küntzel to this podcast. He is a historian and a political scientist, and today we're discussing his new book, Nazis, Islamic Anti-Semitism, and the Middle East. Matthias, willkommen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I have to say, I'm not a professor, I'm just a doctor.
Okay, so Dr. Küntzel, Matthias.
Okay.
So I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Jeffrey Herf of the University of Maryland for introducing me to your work. I think it's been a long time coming since our first correspondence, but I'm glad we finally meet on this program. So I'd like to begin by asking you regarding your thoughts on October the 7th, 2023, and the ongoing war in Israel-Gaza.
Well, 10/7 was a huge caesura, not only for the Jews in the world, but also for the history of anti-Semitism worldwide and for the development in the Middle East. It was a big caesura, and it recalls in many aspects what the Nazis did to the Jews in the Holocaust. For example, if you compare the Hamas charter with Nazi texts of that time, you will find that Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf mentioned the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the anti-Semitic libel, positively, and exactly the same happens with the Charter of Hamas, which is still valid from 1988, which also mentions the Protocol of the Elders of Zion as a real text. Or, for example, if you see that the Hamas Charter says the Jews were responsible for the First World War and also for the Second World War, you find exactly the same saying in Nazi scripts from the 40s. So in some aspects, we have an ideological continuity from 1941 to 2023. And there are other similarities. For example, we have in both cases the dehumanizing of Jews. The Nazis called them vermin. The Islamists call them apes and monkeys. And we have, for example, the paranoid projection. So the Nazis always thought that Jews would kill every German if we don't kill them first. It was this kind of projection, their own ability and their own interest to terminate the life of Jews was propagated to the Jews, projected to the Jews. So the Nazis said, we have to defend ourselves, otherwise the Jews will kill us. So we have to kill them first. And this is very similar to the logic of Hamas texts, which also say if we don't kill the Jews, they will kill us or will fight Islam all the time until it perished. So this is also a similarity. And from this thinking, paranoid thinking, comes another aspect. Saul Friedlander, an important Holocaust researcher, called this aspect, which I want to mention, redemptive anti-Semitism. So in both cases, the Hamas thinks that if we kill the Jews, it will save the world. It's the kind, they believe in their own propaganda. They believe that Jews are responsible for every ill in the world. And so the logic is, if we can get rid of the Jews, we will have a kind of Islamic paradise. The same happened with Germans 80 years ago, who also said, well, if we get rid of the Jews, we can have the eternal German peace. So it's important to see those connections. The past is partly back in the present time.
Mhm. Yes. And to what extent has the lives of Jews in Europe been impacted after October the 7th, and I suppose the Jews of Germany in particular?
Well, there are many aspects. First of all, of course, this massacre recalls the suffering during the Holocaust. Every Jew was shaken by this thought. And so this is one aspect. The other aspect is Jews in their history knows that they are alone when anti-Semites attack them. And there was no big solidarity also in Germany. It was a big solidarity with, people in France after the Bakalan attack, or after the attack against Je suis Charlie, there was a big solidarity campaign, but we didn't have the same in Germany when 10/7 happened. So this was a second traumatized remembering we are alone when it's hard for us. And the third point is, no, this is what I wanted to say.
Yes. And I think it's very troubling when it comes to the fact that if the attack is on Israel, then the sympathy for the Jewish people is massively diminished, so to speak. They
Yes,
think of Israel as a kind of non-legitimate settler colonial entity, whereas normally it is the place where the Jewish people of the world can be safe.
yes. And it's more than ever necessary to defend Israel and to defend the existence of one state in the whole world where Jews can be safe. So this is a big contradiction that in a situation when the Jews are really under attack, that people want to get rid of Israel as well. It's terrible.
Mhm. Yes. You've mentioned the text Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And of course, when you trace the roots of modern anti-Semitism, you inevitably end up at these two texts. How do you explain their enduring pernicious influence to this day?
Well, people don't know how to react to contradictions in the world, and they want to find a very simple solution. And so they think they can personalize conflicts and can say, well, those Jews are responsible for the corona epidemic. Those Jews are responsible for the immigration of foreigners in our countries. And they think it's a kind of simple thinking. And the more the world is difficult to understand, the more this kind of thinking blossoms. So this is one of the reasons, I would say.
Mhm. And to what extent are these texts prominent or influential in the Arab-speaking world at the moment?
Well, it depends. If we compare the situation before 10/7 and after, there is a big difference because in the Arab world there was a positive development with the Abraham Accords. And even in Saudi Arabia, on other countries, other Gulf countries, the education programs changed in favor of Jews and in favor of Israel. It changed only in small steps, but at least this was a big new situation. And so this attack of Islamists, of Hamas Islamists and Islamic Jihad Islamists was aimed to destroy this kind of hope, to destroy this kind of coming together, this kind of normalization. And they were quite successful. So the Arab street is again demanding the end of Israel, which we hadn't seen, had not seen after the Abraham Accords were undersigned. So yes.
Okay. To what extent have there been, I guess, opposition from, say, pious Muslims against the terroristic and Islamist groups like Hamas?
Oh, this is a good question, but I'm sorry that I have to say there was nearly none. Only very few individuals agitated against this kind of new mood after 10/7, and it was so it was a disaster that Jews were killed, more than 1,000 Jews were killed in one day, and then the attack against Jews were escalated. So this is really a contradiction, which is very difficult to explain. And so, well, go ahead with the question.
That's it. In regards to the peace process that started with the Abraham Accords,
Yeah.
so the way I've heard it is that the process that has been achieved with the accords, in that the UAE and Bahrain, they have not rescinded the normalization process.
No.
So far, the process that Israel and these countries have managed to achieve have not been reversed.
It's not bad. You're right. There is some hope that it can be revitalized again.
Yes.
There is some hope, but you know, the world does not take care what's going on in the religious field. And Hamas and Hezbollah are doing a religious war against Israel. Religion is so important. So when Al-Azhar, the very important mosque in Cairo, the Sunni leadership, when they talked about the Hamas attacks, it was very important what was the outcome of this conference about 10/7. But the world was not interested in what would be the outcome of this conference. And it turned out to be in favor of the Hamas attack, which was terrible, of course. And it's necessary to take religion seriously, much more than in the past. People think, well, it's just a kind of image. It's just very superficial that they use religious terms. It's a kind of masquerade, but it's not true. Religion is a very important force behind the attacks of Hamas and Hezbollah. And so the world has to take it seriously, much more than in the past.
Of course, an element that should not be overlooked is how these groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the like, they've managed to use the media to their advantage, and to the extent that so many Westerners are fall prey to the narrative that they propagate. You can say that they've gained some significant success when it comes to fighting the media war.
Yes, it's the media war, and this media war is also supported by Iran. For example, it's supported by China with TikTok. So after 10/7, there was much more anti-Semitic sayings on Chinese internet. And so this is correct. We have a lot of more anti-Semitism in the social media and in the internet. And so this fight has to start against these kind of influencing young people. Sometimes, people have a lot of states like Russia and China invest a lot of money in getting people on their side and attacking the Jewish state. We have some proof from New York City, where people started on the 8th of October to agitate against the Jews and Israel, and it was paid by China's billionaire. So we have to be very careful in watching what is going on this field.
And following up on that, is Al Jazeera an unreliable outlet when it comes to covering the conflict?
Again, please.
Al Jazeera, the
Yeah.
Qatari-funded media outlet, is it an unreliable source when it comes to covering the conflict?
No, in no way. Al Jazeera, it was, the main place for Islamists like Qaradawi, who was a big name in the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al Jazeera. You have to differentiate between the English program and the Arab program. The English program is sometimes a bit more moderate, but the Arab programs are very radical against Jews and Israel.
Yeah. Now, when you trace the roots of Islamic anti-Semitism, I suppose independent of Mein Kampf or the protocols, where would you place its origin?
Well, Islamic anti-Semitism is a combination of two sources. The first source is the anti-Judaism of early Islam. The stories of Muhammad in Medina, the Quran, those sources are one big source for Islamic anti-Semitism. The second source is European anti-Semitism. And if you compare Islamic anti-Judaism from the early time with European anti-Semitism, you'll see big differences because, in the Islamic world, it was Muhammad who fought and killed the Jews. In the Christian world, it was the Jews who allegedly killed God's only son. So this is the reason why in the Christian world, Jews are perceived as mighty, as big, as able to change whole societies, with the Black Death or something like that. While in the Islamic tradition, Jews are considered to be weak, to be, cowardly, and have to hide, and so on and so forth. So it took some time to change the picture of the Jew in the Islamic world in the European direction, that they are also very powerful, that they are a terrible menace for the human race, and so on and so forth. And this happened during the 30s mainly. And Nazi Germany was a force which tried to get this done. And so there are texts from 1937. The first text, which I call Islamic anti-Semitism, was published in the 30s, in the year 1937, and it's called Judaism and Islam. And there we find for the first time this kind of fusion of European anti-Semitism and Islamic thinking from the past.
Yes. So what is this dialectical synthesis between the Islamic anti-Semitic view of the Jews being weak and cowardly, as well as the European import that says the Jews are strong and they control everything and they are responsible for every evil known to man? How would they synthesize that?
Well, it's of course a contradiction. If you read the Hamas Charter from 1988, you will find a hadith from the early times saying that the Muhammad told people at that time that the Jews would be hiding behind trees and stones, and then the stone and the tree would say, "Come on, Muslim, here is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." So this is a very cruel hadith. You see the trembling Jew wanted to save his life, alone, no danger, but even the stone and the tree, so the symbol of the dead nature and the symbol of the living nature, they attack the Jew and say, "We want that this guy will be killed." So this is a very harsh hadith. On the other hand, we find on the same document that the Jews are ruling the world, that they are responsible for this First and Second World War, that they are responsible for all revolutions in the world, and so on and so forth. So this is, of course, a contradiction which can't be come together as a synthesis, but this is anti-Semitism always. There is no logic in it. It's in this case, they just wanted to combine the worst picture of the Jews in Islam with the worst picture of the Jews in Christianity. And they did it, and people believed it. And so this attack was following out of this kind of ideological influence.
I see. Now, from the little that I know about Islamic theology and the life of the Arabs at the outset of Islam, I understand that the Hadith, as you've mentioned, they are quotations from the Prophet, so Muhammad,
Yes.
and there's also the Quran, and I've I've been told that there are certain Islamic scholarly strands that take the Quran and the Hadith as like of equal authority, but there are others who take the Quran as more, I guess, of superior authority than the Hadith, and there are certain Hadiths that should be put into questions because they come from different, I guess, different sources. It's kind of like that Chinese whispers game where someone hears something that the prophet says, and therefore, its authority should be put in suspect. So I wonder if you read further into that, how you characterize the Quran and the Hadith in the Islamic life.
Well, of course, the Quran is more important. The Hadiths are verbal traditions. And there is a big debate always about how true is one hadith or not. So the Quran is more important. And if you read the Quran, you will find some verses in favor of the Jews, but also even more verses against the Jews, very harsh against the Jews. And what is the reason for this contradiction, the obvious contradiction? The reason is the life of Muhammad, the prophet. Because in the first years, he tried to convince the Jews to become Muslims. So the direction of prayer was Jerusalem, not Mecca. And in a way, Muhammad wanted to translate the Torah into Arabic. But the Jews were not prepared to accept Islam as a new religion. And so Muhammad was not successful in trying to convince the Jews to become Muslims. And that was a development very similar to a development in Germany with Martin Luther. Martin Luther, the reformist from the Middle Age, he wanted to convince the Jews to become Christians. And he was nice to them in the first time. And then the Jews resisted this approach, and Martin Luther became very angry against the Jews. And the same happened with Muhammad, although quite earlier in the 7th century. And so this is the reason why the Quran has different aspects of Jews. The interesting thing is that with the beginning of the 30s, Islamists were able to produce only anti-Jewish verses from the Quran. So they falsifies the complex situation in the Quran in order to spread Jew hatred. And so the Nazis were very eager only to quote again and again and again the anti-Jewish quotes of the Quran without telling the people that there are also other verses in the Quran. And until today, the pro-Jewish verses in the Quran are neglected, ignored, and only the anti-Jewish verses are spread.
Yes, and of course, since you mentioned Martin Luther, yeah, one of the texts in the canon of Luther's writings is titled "On the Jews and Their Lives." So, we know how his feelings on the chosen people are.
Yeah.
Now, I think we should clarify what we mean by Islamist and Islamism. So, I'd like to ask a definition from you.
A definition of Islamism.
Yes, and Islamism. So,
well, Islamism, it's not so easy to define because there is, of course, a close relationship with Islam. Every believer turns to the Quran, and also every Islamist turns to the Quran. So Islam is the basis for Islamism. But there are other interpretations of the Quran possible. Islamism is one of the interpretations of the Quran, a radical interpretation which tries to create the situation of Muhammad today. These are Salafists. So they take the Quran literally and try to build the world according to the Quran. There are other Muslims, they try to adopt the Quranic teaching to the reality of life. But Islamists want to turn the reality of life into what the Quran said literally. So this is a very problematic point of view. But at the time being, we have to acknowledge that Islamism is the only big movement which is, a kind of ideology against capitalism, which is, provided with a lot of money all over the world, and which you can find in each part of the world. So it's a kind of successor of communism from the earlier times. And this makes Islamism very dangerous. And especially today, we have so much attacks by Islamists. They were successful in Afghanistan by throwing out the Western world. They were successful in the Sahel zone in Africa by kicking out Western soldiers. And they are very, a big victory for them was 10/7. And so we have to we mustn't believe in illusion. This is a real danger, and the Iranian thinking that Israel has to be eradicated, we have to take it literally and not only as a kind of rhetoric. So this is the lesson of 10/7, I think, that you have to take this kind of aggressive announcements literally and not only as rhetoric.
of course, those who know the Islamists best are the residents and citizens of the countries that they've managed to destroy, say Lebanon or Iran or Afghanistan or Iraq, as you've mentioned. And where it comes to Hamas, not only are they a menace to the Jews and to the Israelis, they're also an oppressive force when it comes to the Palestinians living in Gaza. So why is it that the the Muslims who are pious, who are anti-oppression, who know of these oppressive forces, why are why don't we hear much resistance coming from them, at least in the Western world?
Because there is terror. If you look into the Palestinian territories in the West Bank or in Gaza, there's terror against people who don't agree with Islamists. And this terror was brought in this part of the world by Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, already during the 30s. During the 30s, there was a first element of peace. There was a compromise idea, a two-state solution of 1937. It was a so-called Peel Plan. And there were a lot of Arabs at that time who shared the wish to have this kind of compromise and to have a two-state solution. But the Mufti and his comrades killed everyone who shared the wish for a compromise with the Zionists. This was very elementary, a big experience. And so the same happened during the time between 1946 and 1948, that again, the Mufti was able to kill people who didn't want to get a new two-state solution at that time made as a plan by the United Nations. And so the same happens today. Hamas is killing people who don't agree with their ideological ideas. And this is, of course, very intimidating. If you kill one, you intimidate thousands. And so this is very successful for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard it's a kind of circle, a deadly circle. And it's very difficult to change the situation. And I hope the war in Gaza will, weaken Hamas in a way that they can't be terrorize their own people further on.
Mm-hmm. So at present, how successful do you believe Israel has managed to do that, weaken Hamas?
I'm not an expert on this war, and I don't have the internal information of this war. But what we hear from the press officers in Israel is that Hamas is already quite weakened. But it's not enough just to weaken them. They must lose their ability to conduct war and to govern the Gaza Strip. And so I think the war will go on for some more weeks. I can't hear you.
Yes, yeah, at least, of course. Yeah, I just had my muted. But so since you mentioned Al-Husseini, I believe Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian liberation leader of YOR, um, he was a big admirer of Husseini, and the way I've heard it, I have not read too much into the deep into the history, but the PLO have managed to monopolize the cost of Palestinian liberation via the same means of coercion and other illicit means that Al-Husseini used. And if you've read further into that, how did Yasser Arafat manage to make the PLO the quote-unquote sole representative of the Palestinian people?
Well, he was an acquaintance of Al-Husseini, and he admired him, yes. It's a good question. It was at that time, the Six-Day War of 1967. This played a big role because before that, Palestinians didn't exist. The West Bank was conquered by Jordania, and the Gaza Strip was conquered by Egypt, and neither country thought of a Palestinian state. It was no issue. And then the 67 war took place, and in this situation, Arafat became the leader of the PLO. And so it's a good question to analyze what happened before. Why did this friend of Amin al-Husseini and this radical got the post of becoming the leader of the PLO? I think one of the characteristics of Arafat was that he was able to adopt different images. So he was able to present himself as a kind of socialist, as a kind of third world hero, as a kind of liberation guy. And others weren't able to do that because it was always a fake image given to the people. And so he was very clever in dealing with the situation after the Vietnam War, the left in the world, the United Nations developments, and so on and so forth. So these are reasons why he got the helm of the Palestinian liberation movement at that time.
I've heard that Arafat, who is fluent in both English and Arabic, he says a different thing in English and a different thing in Arabic. And
Yes.
I wonder to what extent are the leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah and I suppose Iran, with their knowledge of Farsi, do they still do that sort of double speak in different languages?
I'm not sure. We talked about Al Jazeera, and there is a double speak very obvious. Um, the Persian leaders don't talk in English too much, very much. They are able, Zarif and others are able to talk English quite well, but they mainly talk in Farsi, and it's what they say is terrible enough. They don't pretend to be a country which would accept the existence of Israel. They don't pretend to be a country which would not support terrorism worldwide. They don't call it terrorism, they call it liberation struggle, but the suicide bombing was an idea by the Iranians. Since Khomeini came to power, there, up to that time, there was no suicide bombing. It was not accepted within Islam. It was Khomeini who created the idea that a martyr who kills Jews with suicide bombing will get a better place in paradise. And so this whole ideology came into existence through the Iranian Revolution, and so there was no need to mince words. They said what they want, and today they are still saying what they want. That is to eradicate the state of Israel, and it's very important that the world takes this seriously. Israel's existence is today really in danger. And it's a kind of existential fight, what they are doing. And they are defending not only themselves, they are defending the free world against Islamists who want to change this whole world and get the world suppressed under religious or under fascist law.
So since you mentioned Iran, recently it had a new president. I haven't learned his name yet. Please excuse me. So do you think that that change will introduce new change in the regime, or it's just the status quo?
It's the status quo. And people don't. There were the first turnout of voters were 40%, so 60% boycotted this kind of pseudo election, and then in the second round, only 50% voted. So the majority of the people in Iran don't have the delusion that this could change something. On the other hand, even the smallest change, if you live in a dictatorship, even some smaller and minimal changes may be an advantage for you as a person. And so 50% voted then for this new guy.
Mhm. Yeah. Of course, going back to Al-Husseini, he maintained a close association with Adolf Hitler. So the connections with Nazis and Islamic anti-Semitism cannot be more obvious there. So why don't you elaborate more on the connections between these two figures?
Well, Al-Husseini met Hitler only once.
Mhm.
He was much closer with Heinrich Himmler,
Ah,
the leader of the SS, and he was himself also in a high rank of the SS. He was an SS soldier, Amin al-Husseini. And so his ability during his exile in Germany from 1941 to 1945 was limited because the Nazis were, of course, stronger than he as a person. So in my analysis, I'm saying that the Al-Husseini was much more important in the years before, during the so-called Arab Revolt between 1936 and 1939, because at that time he terrorized every person who wanted to get in compromise with the Zionists. And he was even more important in the years 1946 until 1948. And historians in Israel agree with me that he was the main person to incite the war against Israel in the year 1948. So I think those both episodes in the 30s and in the 40s are more important. And there he was able really to influence world politics. And it's a pity and it's terrible that the Western allies, who the victors of the Second World War, did not take Al-Husseini on trial and reveal his anti-Semitism and his terrible influence in Germany when he supported the Holocaust as much as he could. So this was a figure of world politics which could continue exactly what he did under the Nazis afterwards. He wanted to kill the idea of a Jewish state in the Middle East, and he did exactly that after 1945. He continued. And at the time, there were big mass demonstrations against the Mufti. People were aware of his connection to the Nazis, but nevertheless, at the beginning of the Cold War, the Allied forces decided that they don't want to, get the Muslim world against them, and so they decided to let him go, which was a big mistake. And I think until today, we are dealing with the results of his policy in the 40s, because the whole refugee crisis of Palestinians who had to leave the country, which is today the main frame for the Middle East conflict, happened during the 40s under the influence of the Mufti of Jerusalem.
So, what was the stance of the Arab world at large during the Second World War?
Well, it was different. The Arab world did not exist. There were countries which were influenced by Britain and also sometimes in favor of Britain. Take the example of Iraq. There was a government in favor of Britain, and it was then there was a putsch against this government by pro-German forces, and then the British conquered the country again. And I don't think the putsch was very much supported by the big masses of Muslims in Iraq. So we have a different picture. There were some countries like Tunisia, which were a bit more anti-Nazi, and people in Egypt, I read from that time that they supported the Nazis and hoped they would fight against the British and against the French, the colonial powers. So it was a different. It's not an one color picture, but different colors.
Yes. How would you respond to this hypothesis or allegations that is not the Jews but Zionism is introduction to the Middle East from, say, the late 19th century to the early 20th that causes these hostile feelings of the Arabs towards the Jews?
I would disagree with this position because until the 30s, it was possible to deal with the Zionist challenge. It was a challenge. Of course, there were territorial conflicts, but there was the ability to find a compromise. There were Arabs at that time who wanted to have the Zionists in Palestine because it could shorten the distance between Europe and this part of the world. They wanted to have a more modern life and hoped that the Jews will bring in more modern developments into the Middle East. There were others who worked sometimes together with the Zionists and sometimes not, like Emir Abdullah from Transjordania. There were a third group who were against Zionism, but in favor of Judaism. And there was only one group that was against Jews at all, that was really anti-Semitic. And that group consists of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the founder of Islamism, and on the other hand, the Mufti of Jerusalem. And so this group was supported very much by Nazi Germany beginning in 1937. And so this balance, which was there before, was destroyed. And the Mufti was able to get the lead of this kind of struggle. And this is, until today, the bad fate of the region.
Yes, and of course, the year 1948 is still under dispute even today. Of course, those who are more or less pro-Palestinian would mention the fact that some 700,000, 800,000 Arabs were displaced from Palestine during that
Sure.
time. But of course, they do not mention the fact that Jewish, the Jewish population from across the Arab world were displaced also, and the phrase "exchange of populations" is frequently used. Do you see an alternative to this historical, I guess, wound? Could this involuntary displacement of such a massive scale have been avoided?
Of course, it's not only the parallel of Jewish flights and Arab flights during those time. But my book analyzes the roots of the war of 1948. And we can see that many Arab leaders at the time didn't want to get this war. And it was a big risk because the United Nations were just founded. It was an authority, and 2/3 of the members of the United Nations were in favor of the partition of the country in a Jewish state and an Arab Muslim state. And so even both superpowers at the time, Soviet Union and United States, agreed in this point that there is a need for a Jewish state and a partition of the country. So it was a kind of risk for Arab leaders to conduct war against this majority of world opinion. And also I can show that leaders in the Arab world knew quite well how weak their armies were. So they were against this war because they knew that they would lose this war. So this was a big mistake by the Arab side, that the Mufti and the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, the biggest anti-Semitic movement of the world, the Muslim Brotherhood had 1 million members in the year 1947. And they mobilized, they attacked, they made big demonstrations so that the leaders of the Arab world were in fear to lose their jobs as leaders if they don't attack Israel, the Jewish part of the two-state solution, in order to kill the Jewish state project. So this was the main mistake in the 40s, and we still, until today, we have the effects of this big mistake of the 30s. And today, well, it's necessary to deal with anti-Semitism in this part of the world, because it's the main thing is you have to know about anti-Semitism, that it's not following a cause, the law of cause and effect. We don't have it with anti-Semitism. If you have the blood libel, no Jew ever drank the blood of a Christian boy, for example. But the Jews were killed, hundreds of Jews were killed because of the blood libel. The Holocaust, there was no cause, but the effect of anti-Semitism. So people today think that Israel policy is the main reason for anti-Semitism in the Arab world, which is not true, because this anti-Semitism was brought to this region before Israel was founded. And at a time when you had different alternatives, and not just to kill Jews or fight them. And so it's very important to have a realistic approach concerning anti-Semitism, and to fight anti-Semitism as a kind of, Voraussetzung. If you don't fight anti-Semitism, there will be no sharing of ideas and peace. There will be no peace.
So I'd like to end on this note. To quote from your book, if it is the case that Nazi propaganda made an important contribution to anti-Semitism in the Arab world, then our view of the Middle East conflict needs to change. So what change do you propose that we make?
Well, the first change is the analysis of anti-Semitism in the Arab world. What is the main reason for this anti-Semitism? Is it Jewish behavior, or is it a kind of thinking which was imported by Europe and especially by Nazi Germany? This is so important, because if you think it's just Israel, it's the main factor for this anti-Semitism, then you think Israel has to change its behavior and then the problem will be out of the world. That is too easy, and that is the reason why 10/7 could happen. Even in the Israeli government, there was an underestimating of the anti-Semitism of Hamas. They didn't believe that Hamas would do what they are propagating. And so I was really shocked by the fact that after the 7th of October, people don't stopped with their traditional kind of thinking. There was no pause, but you have to reflect what happened. How could it happen that this kind of Nazi cruelty came again into this world in the 21st century? And there was no consideration. What are the real reasons and how much is Hamas Carter responsible, and what happened that the Hamas Carter got this color, this anti-Jewish color, and so on and so forth. There was no real reflection of what happened on the 7th of October. And that is the reason why everything seems to go on without stopping. And I miss this kind of consideration, serious consideration about the causes of this massacre.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Dr. Matthias Küntzel, for being on this program.
Okay, thank you.